Welcome to Business Game Changers, where you'll hear expert tips on the big issues and the hottest trends to level up your business game. If you're building a career or building a business, this is Must Hear Radio. Here's your host, Sarah Westall.
Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall. So what do you think? Is it time for a new way of doing things? I mean, let's face it. We are paying over half of our tax money goes to pay off interest payments to foreign bankers. And we are sitting in a situation where infrastructure is crumbling all over the country. And more people go bankrupt because they can't afford medicine for their loved ones. So are we sitting in a time where I think it's time to change how we're doing things? Well, my guest today really believes it is. His name is Jason Erb, and he runs a blog called Exposing Full Capitalism. And he started covering this topic back in 2006, and he covered it through the global financial collapse in 2008. And he covers economic, financial, and political issues. And he's not afraid to go after the big issues, name names, and tell it like it is. And the refreshing part of what he does, whether you agree with his philosophies or not, is he's digging up facts and really looking for what the truth is. In this world of just putting out opinions and all sorts of crap news, he is digging up the facts and trying to figure out what really is going on. And if anything, I can applaud him for that. So he's going to be joining us today, and he's going to be covering all that stuff. So let's welcome Jason to the program. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for inviting me on your show. It's great to be here with you and your listeners.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for coming. Well, what is alternative economics?
Well, that's something that I had really started discovering about in 2007 with the start of the financial collapse in the U.S. and with specifically the credit default swaps and the collateralized debt obligations, which I hadn't been aware of them prior to that time. And I had known about basic economics, had already taken university courses in micro and macroeconomics, but was not aware of some of these newfangled investment vehicles, as they would colloquially and very politically correctly refer them to as. But this is
you
where
mean
I
like derivatives and things like that?
Yeah, that's the overall term then for those two classes of derivatives then that I refer to. And what happened was that, in addition to not being aware of those type of investments, I also wasn't aware of how the supposed alternative choices that are put out there. Well, basically one big one is Austrian economics that's put out there as the big alternative to the current financial system. And one of the biggest people that was promoting that, and a big poster boy for that, was Ron Paul, and former congressman from Texas who they redistricted out of office. But that he was talking about Austrian economics, but the whole thing is like alternative economics. The big thing is about identifying the significance of usury, which is any amount of interest charged, not just some arbitrary amount charged in law. And it's been documented how historically that in all the three religions that to varying extents that it was the three Western religions that it's been regarded as sinful to engage in usury. Although there are certain exceptions that changed over time in the Catholic Church. There was a change in the doctrine and just in the Western society in general, that now it's considered okay to have some amount of interest as long as it's not too much set by law.
Well, yeah, the Catholic Church actually were the ones that got involved in the first banks. And at first they didn't charge interest, and then they realized that, well, they started going under, right? I mean, they just couldn't even afford. You have to charge enough to at least pay your costs. Otherwise, you can't stay in business.
Yeah, you certainly need to go and charge some fees to actually go and recoup the costs of and even make a bit of a profit from the genuine services that you're providing.
Oh, yeah. So you don't necessarily have to do interest. You can charge a fee. But anyways, keep going.
Yeah. So what I noticed is that whether it was Marx or the Austrian economists who are supposedly arguing from two different sides, that the one thing that they had in common, along with all the other economists, whether it's John Maynard Keynes is the big thing. His whole economic theories have been what have been guiding so many of the governments ever since the Great Depression. And whether it's him or whether it's Marx and the Austrians, supposedly at different sides, where Marx wanted to control the entire economy and the Austrians want to have a free market gold standard, they call it, but they want to have freely competing currencies, and they don't want the government involved in money at all. And some of them who are anarchists, they don't want the government involved in anything. But you'd think that they're on opposite sides, but the big thing that they have in common is that they don't talk about the problems with usury. In fact, actually, you'll notice there's an article by the late Murray Rothbard was upset about Aristotle talking about how usury was the most unnatural form of wealth accumulation.
Yeah, and that's what Aristotle said?
Yep. Well, that, based upon the translation of the Greek. So, but that is in one of his big classics. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's that classics on the archive there at MIT. One of them there, if you search for it. But yeah, and of course the Aristotelian thought was what guided the West, and even the Islamic world picked up on that thing. But the whole thing is that there's this notion then perpetrated by the Austrian school, which about the time value of money. So like they'll make the case, kind of what you were alluding to, is that, yeah, you got to make money somehow. That if the banks are going under, if they weren't charging any interest, then they got to have some sort of fees then to pay their own employees and to pay for the buildings and that. They would also perhaps make the argument that in a modern economy, then you have to have some sort of interest, because this is what then some people rely on in justifying interest in addition to the time value money argument, is that, well, it was like simpler economies back then. Like you look to the Middle Ages, and even though there were like these great cathedrals that were built because people had so much time on their hands after they had paid their basic bills because there wasn't usury, it was banned, that wasn't a modern economy. So now we need interest because that reflects the time value that you can get. Like, what would you rather do? That if you have money now, you want to get some return on it because it's worth more now for you to go and spend it than to just give it to someone and get the same value back.
Well, we have the money keeps going up in value, right? With the interest, it's inflating, right? And so that's part of the whole process of them inflating the money. But without it being on a gold standard, then money's just going to keep inflating. And then so that gets to the time value of money.
Yeah, another thing was also going and questioning about the gold standard, because as I had mentioned, that the Austrian school, at least a bunch of proponents of them, now they'll talk about how, well, we're not recommending any political solutions. That's the libertarian brand. We're just going and diagnosing the situation. But you look at least to the personal preferences of some of the economists, like, or at least historians like Tom Woods and Gary North, to name two. But they would support a free market gold standard, they say. But it's important to point out that no such thing has ever existed in history. Like Gary North actually admits that, a longtime Austrian economist, his historian, saying about how the closest thing to it essentially happened in California for about a 5-year period during the gold rush. And his so-called free market gold standard in his particular case actually relies on the government going and enforcing the contract. So I don't find that to be totally free market compared to what the anarcho-capitalist ones are advocating for, saying that, yeah, you have no government involvement whatsoever and the market would actually choose gold. That was Murray Rothbard's argument.
So what do you think? What do you think it should be?
Well, I think that should get back to the roots of that, of having like a free market and things, but that in terms of not going and banning usury, as opposed to what they had done during the medieval ages, and that was like a religious law. Because some people will say that, yeah, like I agree in the aggregate with all these debt contracts out there that they're unpayable. So in a way, it's like a fraudulent thing in the aggregate, but each individual debt could possibly paid off. So that's the argument that the Austrians have going for them, is that saying that these debt contracts with compound interest, they're not fraudulent on their face, because you could still go and generate enough value individually. But I think the biggest thing is about education and pointing out about how that you have the usury, it necessitates an increase in the money supply. Because you had Ellen Brown talking about how that if even with a gold standard, that if the bankers owned they would eventually own all the gold with a compound interest-based monetary system, because just a limited amount of gold that they already have like a big hand in anyway, between like the IMF and the banks of the central banks of the world, and their ability to go and accumulate that on the market by buying up the jewelry where so much of it is in gold. They could go and buy up a lot of that as well. And with the paper contracts, that's the biggest thing with the government going, how they can regulate the gold paper contract market in terms of with the commodities and future exchange, how they can say that this is the minimum amount that you have to have in reserve in order to go and buy like one particular contract, a certain amount of gold. And so that's how they can exercise control over the market there. So I think the thing is to get back to that money is an organic creation. It's created by people. It's not, you don't need to rely on bankers to go and create the money per se, but there should be no government backstopping for the banks, such as having a central bank. So I'd agree with the Austrian economist saying there shouldn't be a central bank, because what that did is that just perpetuated the generational control over the money supply, just pushing more and more money up to the top.
Well, the central bank, the way it's set up with the Federal Reserve and the debt, we pay interest and they never issue enough money to cover the interest. So over time, just mathematically, without even thinking about it, without just doing nothing, just mathematically, over time, it'll become, they'll own everything and everybody will be overwhelmed with debt. Just letting it go.
Yeah, they can kick the can down the road more with this, as some people say, the fiat money system, which in the case of in the U.S., like it's, even though it's the Federal Reserve that goes and, they buy up the bonds. So in a way it is like fiat in terms of that the money is debt, and then it's the Treasury issuing those bonds, and then the Fed going and buying it up, and then other sovereign borrowers, other countries buying it up. But there's this notion among some in alternative, like G. Edward Griffin says, like the bankers hate the idea of having gold. But the thing is that they like the idea of gold when it comes to a certain period of time, is when they know that this whole paper money and numbers in a computer money system that they control, when it's going to reach a breaking point, then that's when they love to start pushing gold as an alternative. So that's another aspect of.
And why do they do that?
Well, because of what you were talking about, that eventually, with the debts becoming increasingly unpayable for more and more people. And the big thing that they can do by going and pushing gold, or even have some sort of gold backing, is that way they can come in and say that this is a stabilization of the monetary system. And like a lot of people will go and believe that. And even I had thought about that back in 2007 until I came across like a radio host then who was giving this alternative perspective about books that were written in the 1800s, when there were all these banking crises, that all these bank panics. So many of them took place in the 1800s because they didn't have, well, there were periods where they had a central bank, but, and this is mostly happened when they didn't have a central bank, was because they didn't have some bigger entity to go and backstop them. And it was pointing out about how there would be the financial class would go and push the notion of gold as some real haven for stability. And even like having Alan Greenspan, people will say, wow, like he sold out when he talked about in the 1960s about gold being essentially the ultimate store of wealth, that governments hate it because you can't manipulate it as much. I'm paraphrasing, especially on the last part, but getting the gist of what he's saying. But I don't see any reason to believe that Alan Greenspan was like so different in terms of being this great guy, and then suddenly he became all bad. I think it was he had an understanding of the way that things had been done, especially since the 1800s, is that they would bring gold in there. That Andrew Jackson, one of the U.S. presidents there, and where he like famously killed the second bank in the United States, but then there was a severe depression in part because of his whole push for gold backing as well. So even someone who I do not think was gotten bought up by the banking elite, but I think that he fell into one of their traps in that particular case. And now there is the fact that gold has been used as a form of currency for over 4,000, some people say 6,000 years, and particularly for over about 2,500 years with regard to the gold coinage. But that's a very different matter of deciding to use that within a particular area, community, and nation, and individually, like as a store of wealth or just for barter purposes, than it is in terms of backing it up as the money supply. And so you have like the Keynesians, and they would talk about, we got to have like even though Keynes called it a barbaric relic, gold. But the thing is that his whole policies will actually end up leading to the bankers going and pushing for gold backing. And you had in 2010, Robert Zoellick, the former head of the World Bank, called for some sort of gold linkage in order to deal with inflation and that to have some sort of standard basis. But this goes back to what I was talking about with Marx, where he's known for the Communist Manifesto. But if you look into Das Kapital, where his economic treatise, where he only wrote the first volume that was published during his lifetime, I think the other were posthumously published, but in there he goes to great pains to talk about how that essentially nothing has a value apart from gold. So even though he talked about the labor theory of value, that things don't have value unless it's there's labor put into it, that's where the real value comes from, he would say. But he tied everything to gold if you go and read Das Kapital, the first volume. And so the thing is, on the other hand, you have the Austrians who talk about we need a free market gold standard. They're just presuming that you would have gold become a big thing. But whether it's Karl Marx or whether it's the Austrians, they seem to be putting a big emphasis on gold, or whether it's the banksters as well.
Okay, well, so people have this paradigm of gold. They feel that there needs to be something that backs the money supply, right? The fiat systems, the way that they're set up, they eventually are going to collapse the way they do it with the debt and things. And mathematically, they will collapse over time because of the debt and how it works. Okay, so we know that. So people want to go to something that is backed by something so that won't happen. Now, what's wrong with having something backed by something over time?
Now, are you talking about at the government level?
Well, that's the thing with gold, is that they're saying, okay, well, if you have gold is backing your currency, then it'll always stay stable and you can manage this. But you're saying that that's not. But why specifically is that not? Because they can manipulate it and they can get control over time and they can buy everything up, and that's the problem with having the gold as the backer. Yeah,
the easy thing now is with the numbers controlled in a computer, like they can also go and control so much of the money supply nowadays due to the technology. But with gold back in the day, like 1800s, like they really like that because they could control a commodity. It's always been a commodity. And even in the 1800s, it was well enough developed in the early 1900s when they had the London gold fix. So
okay, well, so everything right now has problems. You have the fiat currency has problems because it's going to eventually collapse because of the way they do the debt thing. Fiat currency doesn't have to collapse if you don't do the debt and the way they have interest done out, but that's just what they do. So it's going to collapse the way we have our current system. If you have gold, the powers that be go in there and control the whole commodity. They buy things up, and you end up having them have total control over the currency that way. How do you have a currency that's organic that works? How do you set that up?
Well, one of the perhaps few things that I would agree with Karen Hudis, who was a recent guest on your show then, and I had written an article about her about a year and a half ago, which I think may have led you to come across me, was, but she's absolutely right in terms of what talking about the local currencies, that and local and regional currencies, and even you could have a national currency, which has specific purposes. But she's talking about the local currency, and then I've interviewed and been involved with particularly the founder of Mountain Hours, which she referred to there, is that this is the way it should be for the local transactions, is that, and they should be usury free, that again, it's an exchange between producers. So the thing is, like with the banking system, to go and bail out the various banks, of course, you're going to want a bunch of money to go and protect it and ensure your fellow bankers in that particular case. But in the local community, all you need is just some sort of medium of exchange for the value between producers. That's all it takes, is because, like you referred to, that there are cases, there's no inherent reason why the so-called fiat money system, which it's only fiat if it's issued by the government, not if a private banking cartel in the case of the U.S. is doing that. But if it is actually a fiat money system, no reason why it should fail, because you look to the case of where the U.S. was on a gold standard back in the time of the Great Depression, and the whole excuse is that, it was all just the Federal Reserve. But see, that goes to show that, like, some sort of gold backing by itself isn't enough to stop the problems. And actually, it can increase it faster, because there was a sudden demand to people realize that the dollar wasn't really backed by enough production, so they wanted to switch it more into gold. But for the local and regional currencies, that's the big thing, because it's not enough just for local transactions. Like, this is the challenge, is that things are becoming increasingly globalized. So this is where, like, the banksters, the bad bankers, not the ones down the road, or just even some people in some higher positions, perhaps, who don't realize how things have been going on in the past couple hundred years, of what the whole end game is of a one world currency, and then like total political control with some global governing body, at least for like high level issues.
But can I just stop you for a second?
Yep.
And I know that people are talking about going towards, one currency and global control and stuff. But the original people that set it up were around a couple hundred years ago, and they're no longer around. So and they knew it was going to take a while. So you think they set it up so that their great grandkids would have control?
Well, I think in the case of the Federal Reserve, that it was a matter of that they wanted to deal with the historical challenge that they had of their banks going under, like any business will, if it's not successful enough in providing what the customer, what the marketplace needs. So that was their particular focus there. They wanted to have something that looked good on paper, at least, with saying that it's some federal and reserve system, and have like these different regional banks. But really, it was just about solidifying and centralizing control for the banking dynasties.
So it was pretty much exactly what I just said, to preserve their dynasty into as long as possible for their lineage.
Yeah, that was the primary thing there. But then also, if you go and centralize things in the United States, why not eventually go and centralize it around the world? And so I think that was part of the bigger end game with it all.
And then they could just have control over it. Their lineage would have control over everything.
And yeah, anyone that they associate with who's part of their inner circle. But the thing is that they already have like pretty good control as it is, because there's a particular blogger then who has researched in depth more about the currency and stuff more than I have. I focus more on the political aspect, but he has talked about, it's his contention that, for instance, the BRICS banking group, that's just part of it. It's supposed to look like it's some great alternative to the World Bank, IMF, and U.S. dollar dominated system with the Federal Reserve, and even with the EU Bank. But it's about creating another regional currency.
It's the same thing. They just want to do it over there instead of having to deal with ours.
Yep. That is, if it wasn't intended that way, it could eventually be used to have the regional currencies, which had been a stated goal to have these different regional things. I mean, even with the Trilateral Commission, it was all about getting the people from North America, Europe, and Japan specifically at the time as a big power. China was was not influential back in the 70s when it was created, of course, until they switched over to the more capitalist system. So that right there with the Trilateral Commission, that was just about an example of getting the different groups together for more control the way that they saw was best for them to go about it.
Do you think that there's any positive notion of them gaining control, or do you think it's all one big power grab so that they can just have power and control over everybody?
I don't find it good because it creates a...
But is there any redeeming quality? Is there anything that you think that they're trying to sell that, okay, that might make sense in it? Or is it purely a greedy power grab?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I had seen this interview on a public broadcaster where I live in Canada, and there was a guy from Israel, academic, who was talking about how most people view it's portrayed that empires are a bad thing, but actually how they had stabilizing effects and they could go and promote laws and that across a bigger area. So compared to being a barbarian, there could be good aspects to it. So I think part of it is you could say that in a way with what some of them are doing, that there could be benefits in terms of that. One of the big goals seen from me studying what at least they say that they want to do is that they want to eliminate all these wars that have been taking place.
Well, we do know that when Genghis Khan, which we know he was such a heartwarming fella, when he went, China, and he forced everybody to speak one language, that when he did that, the wars within inside his country ceased to go on. It became very peaceful inside the country. Mm-hmm. Even though the way he went and conquered and slaughtered people wasn't all that peaceful.
Well, that's a great example then of what could be pointed to as a benefit. You can always look to what the benefits are, even from what would seem like horrible situations overall. And I think this is an argument then perhaps they would make, but I noticed some very disturbing aspects, for instance, of David Rockefeller, how he said about that there was a great social experiment that took place under Mao's China, and he knows very well that it's between 60 to 80 million people had estimated to have died during that time. In fact, over 40 million just with the famine over the course of a couple of years, I think it was. And so that's what you got to look at it as with what they're saying, is that maybe it's considered good, that it's worth it. It's worth the price to have that sort of thing, to have a unified China, which so many Chinese would realize that having a unified state is a good thing overall, but at what cost?
Well, I was just saying, I was using as an example that they didn't have wars internally, just from a peace standpoint. But when you centralize, the more you centralize, just like in business, the more you centralize, the more you can innovation and the amount of efficiency and some of that stuff can go down, because it's a centralized deal. It's this big bureaucratic nightmare, right, in corporations. Now, if you have a stable unit, let's say you're creating something that's very stable, it doesn't change, and you're putting out mass quantities of it, having a big centralized bureaucracy allows a lot of efficiency and just cranking out this very stable, non-changing thing. But in a company that needs to be innovative and change and get things accomplished in a very changing dynamic environment, you can't have a bunch of centralizations. You have to push it down and decentralize it and give a lot more control to the people that are actually doing the work, because otherwise it just doesn't function. And I think government is very similar to business, in the sense that unless you're talking about something, an infrastructure thing or something where it just needs to chug along and work, then okay, a large centralized thing might work. But as soon as you start talking about people needing to survive and take care of themselves and be dynamic, and every kid has different goals and dreams and wishes, and different cities want to do things differently, now you become just an hindrance to their development and innovation. And so you have to be careful how you manage this stuff. But the other thing with the centralized deal is that over time poverty, because you cannot be creative, innovative, efficient, and free flowing and dynamic. That's where all this poverty starts coming in, because the people are not, what do you call it? They're not motivated. They're not empowered to be able to get things done and survive locally, because the centralized place is trying to take care of that for you. And so now they took that power away from you to survive and change and to be dynamic. And that's where so much of the poverty starts to come over in time, because it's just less efficient and it starts to die. Things die everywhere. It becomes a lower state of energy.
Well, like I can think of some tech examples then of, like, you look to IBM was like myself being involved in the technology sector, and IBM was like really big, and they didn't see the whole big revolution of the microcomputer.
Exactly.
With Microsoft, and started off originally as just two guys, and then with Google is a more recent example of that, and how big they came because of the solutions, and also being in the right place and offering a particular solution, securing a really good deal in the case of Microsoft with IBM. But that's a case where, like, being so big that doesn't necessarily make you able to go and adapt to the changing marketplace.
The wrong people are up on the board and in management positions to be able to handle innovative things. Because, when Steve Jobs tried to market Apple, and when, they were trying to get the whole computer off the ground, and Gates and company, everybody rejected it. Nobody, Xerox did, all these, because the skill sets that allow you to move up in a company and run a big, behemoth, stable, non-innovative entity is not the same thing that gets you to be innovative and dynamic and creating new and refreshing new things to keep your society growing and changing. Now, not everything should be growing and changing, right? I mean, we need to have some stable parts of our economy, because those things chug along and we need that stability there. But the areas that need to be innovative. And that's why you see such an explosion and burst of entrepreneurship all over the place. And I think this goes into any kind of government, any kind of system. If you centralize things that should not be centralized, or that make it inefficient or non-innovative, then you're going to be, shooting yourself in the foot. And so it depends on what things need to be stable and not. And some people think maybe monetary money should be one of those things that need to chug along and be very stable. But they're controlling and manipulating things beyond money with the control of money that they have. And then in that way, it's turning into much more of just the money supply being stable. It's turning into all these things being screwed up and controlled. And then that's what creates the poverty and the lack of innovation and people not having jobs and things. If money could just be stable and not screwed with, they just chug along, be stable, and get out of everybody's way. And if you're going to control the money supply, fine, but that's all you control, then okay, it might work. But we all know that human nature is that once they have control of that, and money controls everything, then they turn around and get their hands into everything, and then it screws everything up.
Yeah, I look at the history as really cyclical with economics, although it has been trending towards more and more centralized control. That, like, you did have, even before the Constitution, there was the Bank of North America, and then you had the two banks of the United States, but they didn't have complete control over the money supply like the Fed does. So they got rid of it, but then it came back then ultimately with the Federal Reserve. And I think people have gotten away from realizing that actually they can go and issue their own credit between each other, that you can't go and have some credit that's tied to the US dollar. That would be considered counterfeiting, but though it's okay to do it as long as you have the privilege through the government, which is controlled by the very banks that control the government itself. But you can have an exchange of value between producers by issuing mutual credit, and so that's actually allowed to do that. And the concept of local currencies is that you could have some entrepreneur starting off and some group where things could all be handled through contract basis, so that it's not the case of that anyone can operate a printing press in their house. They start up some nice little local currency, and then they're going and issuing their own money to make themselves richer. Like, this could all be constrained through contracts, so that enforceable through the judicial system. But what it is I know where there's an entrepreneur near where I live, and he tried rolling out some local currency idea to some of the businesses here. But the biggest thing was they said, yeah, like if you can get 50 other businesses on board first, then I'll join in with you. So that was really the difficulty. It wasn't that we don't understand this idea or that it doesn't make sense at all, but it was about that it's like human nature and challenge in business is the bootstrapping problem of just getting things going. So, but that was heartening, at least, to know that it wasn't a case of that it wasn't understandable and that it was not practical at all. But this is the challenges, because some of the people who come up with these local currencies, they're just average people. And so they don't have some of the deep connections. And of course, there's a big incentive to not use the local currencies when you have the national currency that is being used in all purposes, that it's not just for trade between nations, as really the primary purpose of a national currency should be, but it's being used for the smallest of transactions that could be done locally. But it is challenging in terms of things have been moving more centralized, and a big thing of that is with the shifting technology, people able to travel to far places in a shorter time, with India and China coming on board with more advanced development. And so it is a big challenge to have some sort of really organic currency solution, and you'd be expecting that the people would be coming up with this locally themselves and having some successful system. But when the guys who run the banks, that they would, of course, if they saw one of these things getting too successful, they try to co-opt it themselves.
Just kill it. They just kill it or whatever. Because if they control all that, they don't want to lose that power of control, right? Because we've already established that having control of the money gives you control of everything else. Right. And that's the crux of the problem, because having a centralized money supply and all those things isn't the problem in and of itself. The problem is what they do with the power that gives them. And then they end up doing all sorts of other crap with it. I mean, that's the problem. Go ahead.
Yeah. With it being so centralized, like we noticed about how that it was the banks that were most connected with the top people in the Fed. So even one of the big investment banks, Lehman Brothers, wasn't part of the big bail. They didn't get bailed out, but then Goldman Sachs
they manipulated everything behind the scenes and had the insurance company bailed out, so they got bailed out indirectly. Yeah, so they got bailed out. It was a big game. But what do you think of Greece right now? I mean, I don't understand how the people voted against it, and then by the weekend they ended up approving something that was way worse than what the Greece people have agreed to. And now they're trying to get everybody to, do it. I just don't understand how that all happened. Obviously something behind the scenes is going on that I don't understand.
Yeah, I remember the one Prime Minister, Papandreou, that he was actually had been an attendee of the Bilderberg group, where they have it's not right near the top of the pyramid, but that's where they have every year the discussions, ever since I think it was the 50s, with some of the top business leaders and politicians from around the world. And so he had attended that, but it seemed he was behind this one of the rounds of austerity there, but he ended up resigning because he threatened to go and take the whole case to the Greek people, which is eventually what they did with this latest with the referendum that they had recently had. But as you're talking about, then that then the deal that this supposed socialist prime minister then is talking about now, that it's more favorable to the bankers than the Greek people had been willing to accept. But I think that just shows the struggle that's going on there.
The power they really have.
Yeah, well, even with a former Bilderberg attendee is that, and someone who was seemingly very hospitable to them and going along with the plans at first, but then to so much opposition had enough of it and said, I'm taking it to the people, and then he was gone. So with this guy, the thing is, it's so challenging. I'm just thinking about in the political situation, especially where there's a monarchy, is that if you don't go along, like in the Middle East, if you don't go along with the plan that's put out there, you only have a certain leeway, and they'll just find someone else in the family to go and do that for you. Maybe they'll just arrange for you to go in exile, or you can just go and retire, sort of, or they'll find more creative ways to get rid of you from the scene. And that's the real challenge, is that there's only so much power. An interesting thing from a Canadian leader was actually Canadian Action Party was talking about how the plan, their plan was to have, actually right now it's 5% of the money supply approximately is issued interest free effectively in Canada, because the Canadian government is the sole shareholder of the Bank of Canada, and whenever they go and borrow bonds directly, that then the interest is paid back to the government. So it's about 5% of the money supply. Yeah, that you actually have already working right now showing that can do that. But she was saying that if, like, they wanted to increase that, but saying like, oh, if we increased it to say 50%, there would basically be some sort of war. Well, they would have some other things to do before that. But there was like someone who was at least the head of one of the parties then what was explicitly went and said that. I remember hearing that sometime around 2008 and there. So that's really the whole challenge, is that, and you, as one individual, you can only do so much. And especially like it's so precarious with the government that they have. The governments come and go almost like Italy. It's not a real stable system like in some other countries.
Well, I have some questions for you. That's, I had a guest on here a few weeks ago, and it was one of the reasons I wanted you to bring you on, is because you actually really looked into what Karen Hudis was saying, and she has a different perspective on all sorts of things. And I wanted to know what you've actually analyzed some of the stuff that she's been saying and tried to get down to the facts behind it. And I want to know what you think about what she was saying as far as the banks owing us more than what we owe them, and that they actually, with the gold supply, that it's the people's gold. What is the deal with that? Is there validity behind what she's saying?
I actually did a search before this interview about the total world debt, and there was a source from 2013 saying how it was $220 trillion. And this is so much of an estimate, and it depends exactly what they're counting in that debt. But I went and listened to her in the interview here. I'm trying to see if I had made a note of the exact time that she mentioned it. But somewhere between, I think, 20 to 30 minutes into the interview that you had with her, she actually cited that exact figure of 220 trillion, saying about how that this is what some Japanese forces guy had that basically went around in Asia when the Japanese had invaded in China and Singapore and some other places and Korea, that they had gone and taken some of the gold from those places and then went and issued these bonds. And she actually cited the exact figure of $220 trillion and then saying about, well, that it was with interest, so therefore it's worth over $2 quadrillion. So with that figure, like she's going and matching up then but I think that's just, that number is like just too good to be true. Like she has her sources there, but the problem with one of the sources is that I noticed that there are like some spelling mistakes in it. With this, she has one document. It relates to the global debt facility that she talks about, but it's saying about, that this is like an authorization. I have to see exactly what the document was, but she said, like, is this proof enough for you, when she commented on my article about the gold being in the facility? And the thing is, there were spelling mistakes in there, and it didn't look like an authentic document. So she's presenting, I'm sure, what she thinks to be authentic documents, but how do you get spelling mistakes in some official document like that? That was one problem
Well,
that I had.
you could, but it's probably not. I don't know.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the Nigerian email scams, where it never ceases to amaze how they always keep misspelling words.
I just would like to see more people coming out. You know, if this stuff is real, I want to see hard evidence, and I want to see more people talking about it.
Yeah, like even if you do it,
just seems weird.
I just did a search on Google for, like, before this interview, for the global debt facility, and why is it that it's only her and some bloggers mostly talking about it? Like, the thing is, for something as big as that, there should be more discussion about it, because there's discussion about other things that where the reality might go against actually what we've been told. But there's just so little talking about the global debt facility.
Well, and there could be a lot of, and in that there could be very little if she really is not little in the sense of, if there's a lot of people that are trying to fight this, then there should be a lot there, but there could be very little in the sense of behind the scenes, because all that stuff is pretty covered up. But it seems that if she has this big brigade of people fighting to do this, then where's the brigade?
Yeah, she mentioned one other person by name, and then she had said that there was at least a few of these World Bank whistleblowers out there who they said I remember some interview where she said that they had kind of found each other through, like, odd circumstances, that they didn't all, like, find each other right away. But yeah, like, I'm looking at a Wikipedia article here talking about Yamashita's gold. So even on Wikipedia, they're talking about what she had been referring to about this gold that had been taken then after, like, during World War II. But even, like, this article makes it a good point. Like, I don't trust a lot of the propaganda in Wikipedia in, like, controversial issues, but, like, a good point stands on its own. And I'm seeing here how it says that Japan didn't have the kind of military control over areas of, like, outside of their territory in the Americas anyway, like near Hawaii, and that by 1943 they weren't as powerful then. So it's just asking the question of how could they have, like, moved this massive amounts of gold to supposedly Hawaii, is where the allegation is that so much of this gold is being kept.
Well, and I suppose there is now the ability with global satellites to be able to see where some of this stuff is. You know how they can tell. There's the technology to be able to see where a lot of these reserves are at for real. And so that I could buy if they really could see it. But I just want to see more facts. And I agree with you. A lot of things don't add up. And so basically, if there's a listener out there that has more information and real facts and documents, I want to see that, because I'll share that with everybody. And I think, Jason, you'd like to see that too.
Right. And it goes back to what Andy Gause, who's, like, a regular contributor and researcher on alternative economics, like to use my term, is that he had looked into this specific issue, but he raised the point on an interview that throughout the years it's been like talked about how much gold, like, for instance, when the so-called New World was discovered, they actually had a big spike in inflation, because suddenly all this gold from Peru and from Mexico was suddenly coming over to Europe, and spiked inflation there because of a big find. And so, like, this is all documented throughout the years. And so the thing is that if there was a bunch of gold hiding out in Asia, it's not like they suddenly, like, found big caches of it out of nowhere, or that they were able to secretly mine it. So the question is, how come there wasn't more talk earlier on in history about this huge cache of gold similar to what was, like, brought from the New World, as an example?
Well, there just has to be something out there. If it's real, people should start coming forward and saying, okay, where are the documents? What's going on here? Start showing us some of this stuff and getting it out there.
Right, and it's such an extraordinary claim, because actually the numbers that are being cited are about as much gold as has been acknowledged to have been mined in the history of the world over 6,000 years. So for such an extraordinary claim that there's this parallel gold reserve just sitting in Hawaii, or that if some of it is in the Philippines as well, like that demands extraordinary evidence just by the general principles of proving one's case.
Well, we don't have much time left, so I want to ask you a couple good questions here at the end. Do you think that our currency is going to be reset, or do you think we'll just kind of peter out here and keep going?
Yeah, if by reset you mean that there could be a devaluation, at least saying that now this dollar is worth compared to whatever.
Or they go in and they restructure like you would in a bankruptcy. They cut debt, they restructure, they might issue a new currency and say, okay, we're ready to go and start over.
Oh, that's an inevitability eventually. That just like with Greece, that for a while they had a lot of investment after the euro took place in 1999, but eventually that there was just too much public spending, and also that their labor costs weren't good enough. So even though there was a lot of investment, but they weren't able to export enough. Do
you think it's going to happen around the whole world then? Because almost every country is over their head with debt. I mean, almost everyone's like Greece. I mean, they're going to need to have an ongoing process, because if you just even look to Greece as a template, that they weren't able to roll something out overnight, and the only exception would be they would have to create some huge crisis, or basically what happened in 2008, that the way it just happened upon, the way it did, that they at that time they could have said, yeah, we're going to have to do something, but it would have to be so fast, because the markets can collapse in hours if there's big uncertainty. And that actually was reported on one particular day, that if the Fed hadn't intervened in 2008, that the whole thing could have really collapsed. But we're going to collapse anyways if we don't. I mean, at some point we're just slowly running into a wall. So you think we're going to slowly run into the wall, or do you think at some point the governments of the world are going to come together and say, okay, we need to cut debt, we need to reissue currency, or we need to do what we need to do to fix this, and let's just get it done? Or do you think the can will be kicked down the road so far where eventually we all kind of hit a wall? And there's going to be a lot of suffering. I mean, Greece is just going to keep suffering unless they do something with them.
I see that they have to keep kicking the can down the road, because otherwise they would kind of reveal the plans too much. If like they would need a crisis in order to say, like, here's our solution with this broad based cooperation, as they would say, because otherwise it'd be like, well, how if you have these problems like just with Greece, how is it that suddenly you got this agreement among the top government officials across the world to agree to this?
They won't. It
would
too
reveal
hard.
it too much. Yeah.
So you think it's pretty much we're going to have a lot of suffering and a lot of problems, and just kind of a slow, fizzle out kind of thing, or slow explosion. You know what I'm saying? We just implode slowly, and then by the time the suffering just gets so great, you think that's when they're going to do it? Or do you think there could be a war to do it? Or do you think enough people like us and others are starting to get educated that will say, okay, enough is enough. Bankruptcy laws exist in this country for a certain reason, and it's the same thing worldwide, as far as what's going on with a bankrupt country is like a bankrupt business, and we just have to face the writing on the wall and just do it.
I think that it's going to keep going from crisis to crisis, especially in the Eurozone. And but the advantage that the United States has, being the world reserve currency and can issue the money like through the Fed, so they're just going to continue doing that, because Ben Bernanke, well now Janet Yellen, but Bernanke had said that, like, he was a big student of the Great Depression. And he said that that's where he got the nickname Helicopter Ben. That the problem was that the Fed wasn't issuing enough money during the Great Depression, so they intended to do that. So I think they're going to keep things going in the U.S. for a while. But they need some sort of crisis in order to roll out some solution, but they can't make it too comprehensive too fast. Otherwise, it raises immediate suspicions about the kind of backroom dealings that had already been taking place. But I think the U.S.
the backroom dealings are going on right now, because they're not idiots. They know that this is going to crash. They know that it's a problem. So let's see how long we can keep people happy and satisfied for a while while we figure out a solution. I mean, that has to be the way they're operating.
Yeah, and also with like portraying like gold as some part of the solution. Like even with like Karen Hudis would talk about that, saying that, you know, whether they would have any amount of gold from any facility whatsoever, even the acknowledged IMF gold. Like she talked about that the governments of the world could go and mint some money as currency from the gold reserves, but regardless of where you get it from, like she said, even that would only be a small part of the solution. So that like the banksters know very well that you're not going to be able to roll out gold as some big thing, and they don't necessarily want to do that. They like having it in their vaults and having control of the paper gold. They don't want it for the average person to go and roll out to everyone.
Oh God, no!
No,
You can't have the average person have something. We need to have complete control over that. But
yes. So the thing is that the challenge is that they can like portray gold as some part of the solution, like get you looking towards the gold. Oh, here we're gonna stabilize it, and sure enough, like it'll limit the increase in the money supply for the time being. But then, what other things are they planning? And if there were like some local currencies that got going really well, like they could try to co-opt that in different ways. But the main thing is it's like a revolution of the mind to realize that you don't need to rely on some third party in order to exchange value between producers. And you don't need to have usually any amount of interest to do that. Those are the two big things that I like to impart, regardless of whatever backroom dealing and strong arm tactics are going to be employed by those who already have a big control of the money.
well, the problem is that people, the average person, it has a paradigm, right? I mean, I have a paradigm. We all have paradigms. We've grown up our entire life with this paradigm. And money is just something that is like you breathe, you know. And so to have another paradigm with something that is just so fundamental to how we just are is difficult for almost everyone. And so it's going to be a hard thing to change unless you just do it, I suppose.
Yeah, like with the Mountain Hours in Colorado, that the founder there, that actually he had someone helping out who was part of invested a bunch of money in Ron Paul dollars, but then the big cash that was issuing got seized because they said it was counterfeiting, being too similar to the U.S. dollar of like saying and trust in God, like the way the coinage says in God we trust. And he actually lost a bunch of money in that, someone who was associated with the founder of that. And then, but when he went to Mountain Hours, he was saying that the currency actually circulated compared to the Ron Paul Liberty dollars were actually just being used more as of an investment, but the Mountain Hours were circulating, and that they had been far more successful in about the people actually learning about exchanging value between each other, whereas with those gold and silver coins, that was more of just a collection purpose and for investment for later on.
Yeah, interesting. So there are ways that we can go about doing that. I just think that we're in a situation where people need to know that it's time to fix this, and it's time to realize that we're going to be bankrupt, that we pretty much are, and there's no shame in just dealing with the problem and moving forward, because otherwise, the longer we allow this to be like this, if it's decades of messing around, it just means that much more suffering for everyone. And I think, you know, everyone knows that Greece, I hate to see Greece just continually to suffer and struggle. I mean, it's incredible. And some of these other countries are just as bad. And all that's going to happen is people are going to be incredibly suffering. A lot of suicides and just awful. And war is even worse. So let's just fix it. I don't know. Just restructure. Fix it.
Yeah, the challenge is that the ones who are looking for more centralized control, that they want to have things get worse to even, it serves their purpose to have things get worse so that they can have more of a crisis than to justify like sudden control and to centralize things even more. But there are good things, like I just read in Israel how 1985 they had a similar challenges as Greece did, where their debt was almost double the GDP. And they had an emergency meeting, and the prime minister at the time, at least so the story goes, made sure that they were all meeting for like over 24 hours. No one could leave until they agreed on big changes, and pretty much all the changes I read about were really good, like going and cutting like a lot of wasteful government spending. And the big thing is having an independent money supply that wouldn't be manipulated, and that we're not just going to create new money to go and pay off the debts, because that's one of the surest ways to hyperinflation.
Oh yeah,
so
that doesn't work.
That was where they got things.
You pay it off. You pay it off through everybody else. Everybody pays it just by their dollar being worth less. So everybody has a dollar, ends up paying it evenly. It's a big tax to pay it.
Yeah, if you're already in a particular problem of that, that there's just that there's not enough productivity to back the currency, then yeah, just by issuing more currency, it's like expecting that a drug addict's going to go clean by giving them more drugs.
Exactly. Oh, well, I don't think we're going to solve the problem in this 1 hour, although I think we at least talked about a lot of the issues. And I appreciate you coming on today. I think you've really enlightened us on what this alternative economics is. I don't really like the word alternative on anything. I like to think of it's just trying to understand economics and trying to come up with solutions and not confining us to one way of thinking. And so I don't like alternative on anything. Just like when people say the alternative media, well, it's not the alternative media, it's just journalists that maybe have smaller outlets. But if they're really looking into things and it's good information and facts, it's the media. It's not alternative. Or like same thing with healthcare. Alternative science, no, it's good hard science. It's not alternative science, it's good hard science. It's just because they're not looking at it doesn't mean it's not hard and good science. But so,
right, you could say sound economics is right.
Yeah, it's just economics. We're looking at different things. But thank you so much, Jason, for coming on today and talking to me about all these issues.
Oh, thanks for having me on, and some very insightful discussion that we had.
Yeah, and I can I'm going to have your contact information on my radio page so people can know how to get hold of you and see more of what you do.
Great. Looking forward to hearing from any listeners as well.
Okay, well, have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
So thank you for joining us today. And if you want to get contact information for our guests, you can go to my website at sarahwestall.com. And I also wanted to tell you that starting in September, I will be airing on a different network, and you will be able to find my new shows and my new content on my website directly at sarahwestall.com. So for now, everyone have a phenomenal day.